maybe we could start by you telling us how this project started and how was the process. It seems heavy, and also you talked that you make all of your work almost alone. So, yeah.
That's a great question. Thank you so much, and thank you all again for being here. This film actually started as an accident. I had made maybe like 10 short films with fabric, mostly from my own collections of stuff around the house, or stuff that I could find in other people's houses. And then there was also another batch of films that I made that worked together as a program of 5 films, and one of them was a performance where I was like singing with the film. And it really took off, and I started getting all of these invitations, much like this one, where you just find yourself in a foreign place in the name of cinema. And all of a sudden, my friends would hear where I was going, and they'd say, oh, you know, with fabric, you should really meet so-and-so weaver in this place who's also affiliated with cinema in this place. And it was like every new place introduced me to like another web or network. And I ended up in these situations that I'd never really been in before. Most of my works I make at home, like on an animation stand, similar to the one that you guys have in the stop motion room. So all of a sudden, I was like outside shooting in the elements and meeting a lot of people who both made textiles and sold them, which sort of asked questions about like, what is the best way to treat these scenes? You know what I mean? Like, if you're shooting a documentary, I would imagine like it's all in live action. You can just like go and get like A-roll and B-roll and everything that you need. But I didn't actually know what I needed because I didn't really know what I was trying to say. And that kind of complicated itself as the traveling continued. And again, this was over a period of 5 years. So originally, the first place that I went was Mexico, and I was going to make a film about the relationship between these patterns and Mexico, what was formerly Mexico, and what was America, and how like the American Southwest relates to the history of Mexico. And that would have been probably like a much shorter film. But the major turning point of the film was actually going to China, where, of course, their language is tonal. So they could say, like, hola isn't the same as hola. You know what? Those are different things, and the intonation of what they're saying allows them to say the same words with different pitches and formulate different meanings. And of course, this was a totally new place to me where the alphabet was pictorial and people, whereas like in Portugal, I might catch like a little bit of what you guys are saying. In Spain or Mexico, I might, you know, my Spanish is better than my Portuguese, which is better than my, you know, French, etc. But I could understand nothing. And all of a sudden it became really musical, people talking. So that kind of like expanded the project to this big global scale. And yeah, I mean, for the most part, I work alone. The project doesn't have a producer. I'm the producer, I'm a cinematographer, animator, sound designer, composer, distributor, all of it. But that's not to say that this whole process was alone, because mostly I would meet different people along the way who would want to come and help. You know what I mean? So like in China, for example, there was this journalist. And he was like, what are you doing? You want to go out to this fabric market and do what? You're going to need a translator. And so he would like volunteer to come with me. And some friends might be at a festival or something and want to shoot with me. But the majority of it was shot and completed alone. Yeah, I don't know if that's an answer, but.
Well, but it seems even more complicated because you are shooting in film.
Yeah, it was very complicated to shoot it in film. So I work with a camera that's like this big, and it's probably like 5 to 10 pounds, 6 pounds or something. And honestly, I do think the camera, because it's old and it's vintage and people are like, oh, what's that? it was a point of entry. Like, oh, wow, what are you doing? Please come into my store and shoot it. Do you want to shoot me weaving on your nice vintage camera? So the camera became this kind of showpiece and a point of entry into accessing places that I could shoot, but also like teaching people on the street. You know, I would just be out on the street shooting, and people would want to come up and know, like, what are you doing? What is this? You know, blah, blah, blah. So I'd like explain to them the difference between film and video, the mechanics of animation, the difference between experimental film and mainstream film, and then get deep about the textiles with these strangers, like very quickly. You know, I would just be shooting and they would come up and want to know all these answers, and so I would just have to come up with them off the spot. And I'm a teacher by trade, but I actually felt like that was some of the best teaching that I'd ever done, because the people weren't expecting to like have class. I remember meeting 2 kids that were skipping school in India. They must have been like 14 or something, and they were skipping school, and we saw them in the morning. And then they went and did, I don't know what they went and did. But then they came back a couple of hours later, like, oh, you guys are still here? Can we help you? Yeah, and it presented other problems, like you never know if what you were doing was gonna come out. And I would be shooting for like 14 hours a day, every day, not knowing if it would come out. I could have run into problems at airports, and there was like all this stuff that happened during the making of the film that I actually think would have been quite interesting in the film that couldn't have made it. You know, like the idea of taking film through airport security and what it means to have people that are running airport security not understand what it is, be scared of it, want to x-ray it, think it's a weapon. You know, it really speaks a lot about our international relations when flying, and like the whole idea of borders and things like that. So yeah, but everything like came out for the most part, which was good. But yeah, it basically just meant traveling with a really heavy pack, like tripod, camera, probably like that much film, and then by the end traveling with a lot of fabrics too. So I was kind of like a donkey.
Who wants to put questions?
I'm still thinking about it. I don't need a microphone, I think. I'm still thinking about it, and it will take me quite a while to assimilate everything. And what I would like you to comment, if it makes any sense to you, without putting aside or blurring the experimental part of your film. And when you were talking about Mexico, it became a little, well, it's a departing point for me. Can you talk a little bit about the saying of what were you trying to say? Okay, because it raised me a lot of things. Thinking about fabric is thinking about people, migration. This is usually the thing that you bring with you because it's the lighter, a scarf, a tapestry, and so on. I also cannot not think about women, and you used 2 voices in your film in 2 situations, and both were more or less feminine, if I can say so. And of course, the presence of the sea as a border, and thinking about everything that's going on now. I mean, I don't know, can you comment on, does it make any sense to you?
Yeah, totally, and I think you got it. I think you totally understood it. And I think that, you know, even though I'd made some films with textiles before, starting this film, going into the places where the textiles were made and sold, completely opened them up to me. And I don't see those previous films in the same way anymore. And ultimately, my experience through making the film was that I learned that the textile, as you intuited, is a portal to like the history of humans. And if you think about a textile long enough, you can think about like power, gender relations, religion, governance, the idea of mapping space, capitalism, homogeneity, ownership, like this thing that you mentioned about buying the textile as a souvenir became really interesting, especially when you like go into the history of it, like African wax prints are actually a result of Dutch colonization. Like, Portugal gets a lot of reputation for the tile, but having been to Morocco, I'm like, I don't know, like, is this actually a Moroccan import, you know? And so and like the pashminas that we could buy everywhere right now as a souvenir of that place aren't really necessarily even from that place anymore, you know what I mean? And so to me, it became about this like reflexive feedback chamber of appropriation. And I know that appropriation is like a hot ticket term for us right now, but I think the way that we're talking about it for the most part is that it's like a Eurocentric pull on another being. But my experience of traveling actually told me that it's both people, both sides pulling from each other as a result of constantly changing technology. So like the faster you have access to something, the more easy it is to disseminate and to be reflexively appropriated. Like, what did it mean for James Brown to hear Fela Kuti, and then alternatively for Fela Kuti to hear James Brown? And how did these things influence each other? So to me, the movie became about this like long lineage of what the textile represented, but it was important for me not to really, like, it's a choice not to have any words in the film for the most part and no narration. Because of course, for the first time, I was presented with this notion of ethnographic film. I don't consider myself an ethnographer. I don't consider myself an anthropologist. I don't even know if I believe in those disciplines as they are. So I like to think about the film as like an ethnography in some way and ask the question like, what could you learn about place from things as opposed to people? So I wanted the film to be like a similar just portal for the viewer so that I wasn't trying to tell you anything. You know, I have all sorts of opinions, you know, like the labor laws are screwed and we shouldn't do this, and I question education even though I'm an educator, you know, so but instead the film just like goes, and I wanted to know, like, I think that so often we consider the screen as something that can teach us, and I wondered what would happen if the film could actually like learn as it was going along. Really, in many ways, thinking again about this lineage from religion, how this room is set up similarly to a church, you know, how this screen takes on the role of the stained glass window, and how the narrator in a documentary is known as the voice of God, which you know, we were talking about sacred music and everything, how you would, and in Gregorian chanting, you would have like the people singing to the angels, right? And they would sing back and forth. And the space of a classroom is very similar as well, where it's like one person delivering you information that you're supposed to believe. And so I came out of making this film no longer believing in facts. And I think that's the point that we've sort of gotten to in our culture, where, you know, we have like a religious right argument in America where you see bumper stickers that say science is real. And then I get where they're going with that, you know, and they want abortion to be legal or something, and I get it. But then I'm almost like, is science real? It's very arbitrary, these rules. And of course, as we know, the nomenclature that's associated with all knowledge is tied up with authorship and ownership over ideas, you know, and how is that any different than like colonization of space, if that makes sense? So that's a very long-winded answer to some of your questions, but just to touch on the ocean, because I didn't really have a linguistic way of structuring this, or like a narrative way, I wanted to try and structure it spatially, where it's like now the textiles are existing in light, and then we like go to an ocean and travel somewhere else. Then now we're like seeing them in the library and understanding how we learn about them, and then we like travel somewhere else, and now we're selling them, or now we're making them, or strobing the two processes. That became like the only choice I had to move the film forward. And I wanted, admittedly, all of the songs had lyrics at some point, but they had to go because it was just too limiting of a scope of ideas. Of course, I'm operating in pop music, and one thing I noticed as I was writing my songs is that pop music doesn't actually have a lot of lyrics. You know, so it's hard to put like a theoretical essay into a pop song, especially when the images are so ebullient and fast. And I think the film kind of rides this fine line between being critical and celebratory, because, you know, I think that's just what it means to live in 2019. Like, you could be critical of every structure, but you are also complicit and benefit from it in many ways. So yeah, that's where the ocean came into it. Thank you for your observations and questions.
More questions? Better with this.
Since you had no narrative to conduct yourself while filming, what made you decide which country to film in, where to film in, and what exactly to film? What exactly to shoot, I'm sorry.
That's a great question. So after I started, I took my camera everywhere that I was invited and shot everywhere that I was invited. And then I started to make some pretty pointed decisions that you don't know as a viewer. So like when we're at the ports, we're actually at the port of Tangier and at the port of Cadiz, which is the first point of entry into Europe from Africa, and like going through all of these lineages of trade. But again, it seemed, and that's another thing, it's a choice I could have made, was to have told the audience, like, now we are here, and now we are here, and now we are here, and now we are here. But to me, it seemed like I could only represent a portion of the truth in any given place, because as a tourist, you never really permeate the actual culture. So I wanted to keep it kind of with some distance, as if the position was from a tourist, you know what I mean? So I shot everywhere, and really a lot of the decisions around where I would shoot within those places just came to do with like access. You know what I mean? Like, oh, is this brick wall empty with no one around and I could be here for 2 hours? Great. This is a great brick wall. This will work just perfectly. And after I'd started to amass a little bit of footage, then I could look for more things. Like after going 3 places, I had 3 staircases. So then I was like, okay, I need to shoot a staircase everywhere I go. I need to shoot the fabrics traveling in all ways, in cars, on trains, on planes, on boats. I want to shoot them being made by hand and being made with machines, and I want to shoot them being sold. So that was what sort of governed my shooting process. And unlike other movies of mine, which are usually just like what I shoot is the movie, I had a 6-to-1 shooting ratio on this. So I actually shot about like 6 or 7 hours of footage, and ended up actually cutting out a lot of the stuff that was shot on the road. And a lot of the things in the movie are actually like faked at home and things like that. So yeah, that's what happened.
Hi, Jodie. Thank you so much for your time and congratulations on your movie. I was very intrigued by one aspect, the way that you represent time. Visually, you have a lot of stylistic resources like stop motion, fast forward, slow motion. But in terms of sounds, you always have music, and the sounds that are also incorporated are very continuous. Could you speak about a bit of that, please? Thank you so much.
Sure, thank you so much. So the piece is structured like a textile, where each song occupies a row of patterns within a textile, and then they're all conjoined by moments of diegetic sound, or like moments of rest from the music. And then there's like another complication with the music, because a lot of the music is made with sounds that would otherwise be considered diegetic sounds, like songs made out of birds chirping, or songs made out of sewing machines or oceans or things like that. And the structure of the music is that it starts out with the most complicated time signature that I could muster, which is 11/8, and then goes all the way down to something with no rhythm, like the end section where I'm just shooting animation. And a lot of my influence for the music, it came from a few different inspirations. One, I'm part of the lineage of this thing we know as like experimental animation and visual music, which is on one hand like a high art form of making analogies between image and sound, but like all forms of artisanal practices, this has been consumed by the mainstream media and then plopped back into our consciousness by ways of like rave graphics or screensavers, concert visuals, and things like that. So I wanted, like, I've gotten a few questions about this, like, can't we dance for this? And that was kind of like on my mind, you know, should this be in a cinema? Should I allow it to like be at a dance club or something like that? Maybe it would be better. But the problem is a lot of experimental people are really serious and like you can't trust them to participate, you know? So it's kind of cumbersome in that way. And then the other inspiration with the sound goes back again to this idea of homogeneity and access. So like in the same way that I could go to a place in India with a really rich textile tradition and people wanted to wear Nike t-shirts, they also had a really rich musical tradition and were listening to Drake and Beyonce. Every country, every place. And so there was this question about like, what does it mean to all have music editors on our computers, and how does it make all of our music similar? And even in producing the music, I thought a lot about really this parallel in the development of technology between music and animation, both art forms of time, and the idea of computational music and computational animation historically are very parallel. So all of a sudden, in like late 50s, all of a sudden we have a way to systematize time. Whereas before, like if you're a musician and you're playing in a band, you like count together. Maybe you have a metronome or something like that. But in music classes, I've been given assignments to like click a steady beat for 10 minutes, and then you sit around analyzing them, how like you're never gonna be a computer. You know what I mean? So this idea of having things on these musical grids of computational music software, which are similar in my mind to like the computational grids of animation software, became at the forefront of a lot of my interests. Really thinking about, again, this development of technology and the lack of nuance that comes along with everything being made by machines. So something else I noticed a lot while I was listening to contemporary pop music is that like nobody just sings on their recordings anymore. Like everyone is auto-tuned. Even Beyonce, who's a really talented vocalist, this is like the guise of a professional sounding song for us at this point, is to have this kind of like light auto-tune or reverb. Another thing I notice in contemporary pop music is that a lot of the times people cut out the breaths of the vocalists, where in something like Michael Jackson, I don't know if we're allowed to talk about him anymore, but like he used breath as percussion, you know, and things like that just don't happen anymore. So yeah, those were some of my inspirations with the sound.
I think there are two things interesting also in the film that I noticed this time. One is that you also want to make fun sometimes, and that's several parts, but the part when you use the music, the jingle for Skype, and then going on with that, with the mirror, it's really funny. And at the same time, I felt some pieces, some parts, a little bit sad in a way.
I think the whole movie is sad, and I actually get secretly angry when people call it like playful and like, oh my God, that was ecstatic. I'm just like, no, it was a tragedy. But again, it's like this fine line between like being celebratory and critical. To go back to your sound question again really quick, another inspiration was like monotony of just like boom, 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 boom. And then with your comment about the mirrors, that was something else that really became apparent to me, but I couldn't actually like voice it. So the mirrors are actually like a substitute for the cell phone, which was another huge part of the journey, like listening to Google Maps pronounce whatever street name in Thailand, like turn left on Prakapiam Timtum. It's like, what? Like the Google doesn't understand it, you know what I mean? And, or the idea of translation software, you know, it doesn't work for the most part, or like it kind of works, but the nuance is lost. And in thinking about the development of the textile and something I was talking about earlier, like I feel like the textile is one of the first places that we started to be able to render the three-dimensional. And it's pre-perspective, like drawing perspective, you know what I mean? And drawing perspective was one step closer to be able to like draw perfectly. And then when you bring that into the idea of painting and your idea to use, and your ways of using light as an idea to, as a way to like make your painting photographic, enter the camera, no one needs to paint photographically anymore. I'm seeing a pattern here. We are mimics. All of us, humans, are natural mimics, and we wish to see reality mirrored in front of us. And so there's this big question I have, and this will probably come up on Friday, if any of you can come, is this question of whether or not the screen is a mirror or a window, or whether or not it can be both. But yeah, and I think the movie really is really sad, because, you know, my whole point about like what is the Grand Bazaar, what am I trying to say? The Grand Bazaar became this stand-in for like an insurmountable weight for all of this history that is past and unable to be undone in some ways, or the feeling that you get when you notice all the problems in the world but you don't know how to fix any of them or something like that. And another thing that really came across in the making of the film is this idea of being alien, being a foreigner, being alone, working alone. And this might come up on Friday too, but I think that animation is one of the most powerful vehicles through which to study labor, because it is an art form that was industrialized during the height of Taylorism, which is like assembly line production, like the way to make cars. You know, like you make the tires and I'll make the brakes and you make the steering wheel, and like all of you have a different part, and then at the end we have the car. And like I'll make the keyframes and you make the in-betweens and you color them and you shoot them and you do the sound. Animation, I don't think actually makes a lot of sense for one person to do it. You know, it's really difficult. And if you get deep into Karl Marx and his thoughts on the alienation of the laborer and how the laborer is alienated like 4 times from the product they're producing, from the other people around them, from themselves, and from nature, animation becomes a really fertile landscape to think about all this, especially as we've moved into 3D technology or even beyond 3D technology, because if the goal is just to represent reality, why are we working so hard? You know what I mean? So I'm kind of more in the school of like animation should make the impossible possible, as opposed to just like using Earth's physics to make characters do stuff, because that's a mirror, but I want a window, or I don't. Is that an answer? I think it is sad though. I think the movie is a sad movie.
More questions or comments? Pedro, pode ser aqui primeiro.
Hello.
Hi.
This is not a question, but it's actually a commentary based on what you said about the screen being a window and at the same time a mirror. I just want to congratulate you because I'm doing this investigation work, and I'm investigating a bit about documentary film, and the importance of animation in documentary. There is this, I'm sorry guys from cinema, correct me if I'm wrong, but there is this type of documentary which is expository documentary, and it uses animation a lot because we recreate some kind of event.
Truth, markers
truth,
of truth,
exactly.
diagrams,
Yes,
and
but
recreations.
the thing about animation that I think that you accomplished in your movie is that animation allows you to show and share that truth through your own eyes and through your own perspective, and since you're so close with fabric and all of that you showed us, I think you did a really good job showing us your truth about this mimical world and about how everything has to be the same. Back to what you said about everything being, yeah, exactly. So yeah, congratulations. I just wanted to make a comment on that and probably answer a bit about window mirror situation. I think it can be both.
I think it can be both too, and thank you for your comment. I think that was something that was central to my questions making the film, is that I feel like animation is a great vehicle to use for documentary because it proves the impossibility of documentary. And of course, because I thought this was a documentary, I was like applying for documentary funding. What are those applications asking? Who are your characters? What do they want? What do they desire? How will they end up with what they want? I'm like, this is fiction language, and I think that's like documentary has reached this kind of point where we understand that each maker is giving their own lens upon a subject, even in quieter, more experimental realms. Like in the past 10 or 20 years or something, these like slow, vast, sensory, ethnographic films exist, and they're not like really telling you anything, but at the same time they're telling you so much about like a very specific point of view that is still in some ways perpetuating a colonialist gaze. Not that this is not, but I did, and it bothers me that animation is used in documentary as a way just to extend these markers of knowledge, and that's kind of where I was going in the library scene, looking at like how to make all these textiles and like who wrote about it, after going to certain villages and listening like, oh, so-and-so came and wrote a book about my practice, but they didn't translate, they only translated the word for plant. So you read the book and it just says plant, 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 plant over and over again, but I had told them different types of plants and it didn't make it in the book and they didn't give me a copy and, stuff like that. It's tangled.
Thank you, Jodie, for the film. I was just passing it over and over again on my mind. And one of the things that I found most interesting within this rhythm that the image and the sound are dialoguing with each other is this idea that repetition might not be just this pattern or system that imprisons us, but in your film it struck me more like repetition as an act of freedom, as when we repeat the same word over and over again and she loses that kind of intuitive meaning that is immediate and it starts being something else, sound, or like all the sounds that you use, a bird stops being a bird and becomes being just this high-pitch tone and rhythm for your song. So it got me thinking about the encoding in the world we live in, and your film, it was like this act of freedom, just allowing us to recode it, creating new patterns or seeing new rhythms. And I think that was what the film was gave me more to my way of seeing and liking it. So my question would be this act of freedom. It was something you were looking for, just to give the spectator this.
Great question and observation. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think as far as freedom is concerned, I definitely wanted to. I think that's a reason to work in experimental film, to let what the film is about be up to the viewer. Like, what is your film about? I don't know. What was it about for you? Because, like, it can be all of those things. You know what I mean? But this thing that you mentioned about, like, encoding and recoding and things like that was extremely central to my film, because it became about the patterns or the motifs within the patterns in the textiles or in the music or in the language, and when they are utilitarian versus when they're decorative, like when they mean something to you and when they don't. So like the star of my film becomes the diamond motif, and through many different textile cultures, it means different. It like when you go back, textiles could be musical scores. They could have their own language within them, and the different motifs mean different things. So the diamond could mean like mountain reflecting in lake, or mouth, or woman, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Again, with the forms that show up in our alphabets. Everything, and to go back to Chinese, since we already talked about it, is like decorative to me. It has no utilitarian meaning. And then to go into this whole thing of encoding, I mean, maybe some of you know this, but the jacquard loom is what gave birth to binary code, which is why we see the code within those scenes with the loom, because these punch cards were like the first computers in some ways. So in some ways, the film is about this process of like transmission without anything ever landing anywhere. And I feel like that is something that could frustrate a viewer, and people have said that to me before, like, why didn't you tell me what it meant? And I had to say, like, because I didn't know what, you know, like, do I trust this book that told me what it meant? No, I don't, because what if that person, like, didn't translate it correctly or whatever? So it becomes, it's almost like a data regurgitation or something like that. In many ways, I felt I was, like, creating, like, a time capsule to give to an alien, so that he could like sort it all out for us. You know what I mean? Like, God, you guys have a lot of issues going on right now. I just saw this movie and, oh geez, there's a lot of stuff like embedded. So it becomes about this like space, this liminal space where nothing really like has a home and it's constantly floating. So I'm glad you intuited that. Thank you.
So last question for Pedro.
For me, there's a very interesting sequence towards the end of the movie, where there's a very epileptic montage of human skin that's tattooed and all those fabrics with interesting patterns. Is that a way of merging all those textiles and all those cultural capitalistic ways into the human skin, like that all? Embedding in the market into the person, you know, is that I'm sorry, that's the question, I'm sorry.
That's a great question, and that scene sticks out a lot to people. And some people, when I was making the movie, were like, "Are you sure about that scene?" And I was like, "Yeah, I'm totally sure about it. What are you talking about?" And secretly, between us, I had the idea for a tattoo movie for a really long time, and it was going to be called Tramp Stamp. I don't know if it's cool to call them that anymore, but that's what they call them in America, these like lower back tattoos. And I had this dream to go to like a music festival and just take pictures of people's lower back tattoos. But I think that moment has passed where we don't get them anymore, right? I don't think. But there was this moment like in the 90s, you guys were probably like born in the early 90s or something, right? No? When were you born? Late 90s, okay, good. So like in the 90s, back all the way in the 90s, these like Chinese and Japanese tattoos were really popular. The tribal rings were really popular, and like nobody cared. But again, it wasn't just white people getting them. Like when you go around, you can see them everywhere, because once they hit the screen, people absorb them from all over the place, right? That's America's biggest export, guns and ideology via the screen, in a way, right? So I don't know that I was necessary. I mean, yeah, I think in some ways there's definitely a read on like a fusion of the identity through which we can see through these tattoos and the fabrics. Not to mention that, you know, our body is something that we've chosen as a society to cover with fabric. But to me, it just became this moment because I had, in that same song, used a bunch of different alphabets. It became a moment to, again, sort of like take one step further as to how these motifs end up in the world, and like how this person ends up with something they think says joy right here, but actually says like poop or something like that. You know what I mean? These moments of being lost in translation through the notion to like style yourself. And again, back to this whole idea of like mirror, is the screen a mirror or a window? Another big realization in making the movie to me was like how we're stuck between notions of like an individual society or a collective society, where, you know, it's like me, this is my selfie, like my thing, like what's good for me is good for me, versus what is good for you is good for me. And obviously we have not made a lot of decisions based on like what is good for you is good for me. So I think that was a big part of that scene in some ways too, was this whole idea of like individuality, again in this homogenous thing, this homogenous world that we're living in. Like this is my personal brand's Instagram filter of choice. Which yeah, again goes back to like the software, you know, something like the Adobe Suite or Ableton Live or something like that, electronic music software. These are softwares that pretend that they're like epicenters of creativity, yet they only give you certain options. You can only use certain brushstrokes. You can only use certain colors. You can only use certain samples. So it's an illusion, this idea of it being an epicenter of creativity, because it's all like proprietary sampling, if that makes sense. I think the sample is big in this piece too.
Jodie, do you want to talk about Friday just to end this session?
Sure, yeah. Thank you so much. On Friday at 5 o'clock? 3 o'clock. We're going to meet back in here for a little masterclass workshop kind of thing. And it's going to last for about 3 hours with a break. And I'll discuss some of my other films. I'll also discuss some of the making behind the Grand Bazaar. And then I'd also like to take about half of the session to share some rare and historical animations by some of my biggest influences. So we'll probably be thinking a lot about labor in the self on Friday. And again, not only animation, but like all possibilities of communication and cinema. So I hope you can make it. I made all the slides by hand.
Jodie, thank you very much for
this
inspirational talk. Thanks.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for all your great questions.